Okay, so let me also begin by thanking JNU Academy for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this interaction. And as you could see, Professor Varshney's skill of combining statistical data with theoretical argument closely read the articles that were circulated. One of the compulsive things I found was that he is both combative and argumentative and also persuasive. And I don't know how he does this. This is something that you need to tell us your trade secret of doing both. So I immensely enjoyed listening to him here, reading the articles that were circulated. And I used to raise few questions in terms of the emergent contemporary scenario as to the arguments that he presented. Definitely they touch upon at the heart of certain issues that concern all of us. The primary dichotomy that he has faced or opposed is in terms of the electoral versus the liberal democracy. And the argument is that electoral India continues to be more or less free and a fair democracy, but there is an undermining of liberal part of the liberal democracy in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of association, minority rights, and federalism. That's the broad import of his argument, and then he moves on in terms of what post-2024, what do we expect. I had a slightly different take from this, that while I have no disagreement with this frame of Professor Varshney's, but I feel that the heart of the matter of Hindu nationalist mobilization post-2014 does not end with undermining liberal constitutional principles. That's the thing that we know in traditional liberal democracies. The civil society spaces can be resurrected, there can be mass protests in terms of modes of resistance against undermining liberalism and constitutionalism. The greater challenge I feel is that the Hindu nationalist project over a period of time has really learned to go ahead with its what you call communitarian, which one could add stroke majoritarian project, by precisely deploying precisely those liberal principles that we have advocated. For me, that is a much greater challenge, and for me, that is partly also provides the explanation as to why political opposition in this country is unable to get its act together. It is not merely lack of will, lack of funds, and all of those, but there is a deep epistemic problem right at the heart. And Hindu nationalism of today is not the Hindu nationalism of the times of Gudavarthy and Savarkar. So to my mind, it is precisely by weaponizing and deploying liberal principles that Hindu nationalism is creating a majoritarian ethnic state in India. 2 or 3 examples I will give you. One, the example that Professor Varshney is very fond of is question of federalism. And my question to you, Professor Varshney, would be how would we then explain that BJP has been at the forefront of championing formation of smaller states. Both in the first round when Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand were created, and in the recent round formation of Telangana. If we were to go by your analysis of liberal constitutional principles, this is perfectly constitutional, this is perfectly liberal. That they believe in because deepening of federalism that we have learned over the last few decades is formation of smaller states because it gives better governance, local governance, resource distribution, so on. But what is the logic that Hindu nationalists, one can only do this. That's my side point in terms of partly interpreting to data, while I see your strong point, is that how do we then analyze that except for an interpretative leap, that the reason why Hindu nationalists are for formation of smaller states is a logic that they feel formation of many more smaller states will give India by default a stronger center and therefore undermine federalism. So a simple liberal reading of formation of smaller states has already been hacked and hijacked by the Hindu nationalists. Similar would be my question on the point you made on participation and representation remain at the heart of liberal principles. BJP has been at the forefront of expanding representation that both regional parties, least to talk about left parties and even Congress. What Congress, left and regional parties could not do for 50 years, BJP did in 10 years. If we were to analyze this in classical liberal, they are nothing short of being revolutionary. Look at the number of seats, and that's where data becomes important. Number of seats in terms of EBCs, OBCs, and giving the top constitutional positions from president to prime minister to chief ministers to cabinet berths. Now this again, if you analyze this at the face of it, it will run against the thesis that you presented of Savarkar and Gudavarthy of creating a Hindu, which is stroke Brahmanical majoritarian state. Again, what is the logic? How is BJP and RSS, backed by the RSS, willing to do this? There is no doubt that BJP RSS continue to remain, and that's why I am in full agreement with you in terms of creating a communitarian, majoritarian, top-down state, centralized state, but they are able to also revolutionize in terms of their representative quality, which is a liberal principle. Again, we can only interpret this in a methodological sense to an interpretative leap. Data cannot speak for itself. And my understanding is that BJP has similar logic as with the federal principle, that if you redistribute and disturb internal hierarchies within OBCs and Dalits, and that's why we have to watch out the consequence of today's Supreme Court judgment in terms of subclassification, which is going to have long-term consequences, and there are multiple possibilities of distortion. BJP and RSS sense is that if you redistribute power internally, first you will not have larger conglomeration of being Dalit and OBCs in terms of political mobilization. They remain internally divided. But one cannot argue it is not a democratic principle not to redistribute resources within these caste groups. So in a graded society with graded inequalities that Ambedkar talked about, with skewed relations between caste Hindus, the power is so skewed, combined with further centralization under neoliberalism. Oxfam International report is there for all of us to see. In that light, if one interprets what RSS, how they look at this process of internal subclassification, is that one, it weakens Dalit OBC internal mobilization because it questions and weakens the dominant groups within these groups, which are in a position to resist caste Hindu domination. And by default, therefore, it will further open space for reification of power of caste Hindus. But they are doing it in the name by institutionalizing liberal, democratic, even redistributive policies. Therefore, there is something much more complex happening with Hindu nationalist politics than the electoral liberal dichotomy. The third point would be the Pew Research. You have quoted Pew Research survey in your article in Journal of Democracy. And you have referred to the part on pluralism. But the report also suggests that majority of BJP's voters champion the principles of pluralism and diversity. More than 70% of BJP voters said that India needs diversity. Again, if you go by liberal interpretation of liberalism and pluralism, we find no conflict between the constitutional interpretation of liberalism and pluralism and BJP, RSS and deployment of pluralism. They don't find that conflictual with their agenda. Why is that so? The Pew Research Survey ends by saying that, but what majority of Hindus meant by pluralism and diversity is what it calls living together separately. That most of them said that we value diversity, but we do not want to cohabit with people of other religion, and now it's other castes. I hesitate to call this quick hand, shorthand, grammatical, top down, because there is a process of culturalization of caste that has happened post neoliberalism. I don't have the time to get into the details, but I have been consistently arguing that culturalization of caste practices has happened over the last 20-30 years after the certain mobility that caste groups have. So it's a very, very strange process again, that deeper social fragmentation of caste and partial social mobility have both resulted in culturalization of caste and urge for greater integration to Hindu unity rather than Ambedkarite principle of political differences and social differences. Why should this be so? It's a great question. We will not have time to get into the details of it, but this could be my question to, and I would be extremely interested to listen to Professor Varshney's response to this. Fourth would be, he did not present this part of his argument today, but it's there in his article, and I recommend all of you to strongly to read these articles, that his piece in Journal of Democracy, and especially his piece in that edited volume. It's a fantastic read to go into how much of details he gets into. And the best part is, unlike most social scientists, I think Professor Varshney has an argument. And he makes it very clear. Whether you like it or not, he gives you an argument. You like it, you don't like it, but he cuts the clutter. And here he makes a very interesting argument that Indian democracy, the vastly poor and illiterate masses were in no position to demand democracy, yet Indian elites committed themselves to universal franchise. The constitution, an expression of elite values to begin with, started engaging elite interests by mid-1970s. So his broad argument, he argues, is that Indian democracy was the result of elite consensus, which goes against much of political economy arguments which talk of structural factors, and which also runs in the face of much of post-colonial analysis which foreground cultural factors. So I don't have the time to get into details. Also, he did not present this aspect, because I would argue that the principles of what he calls elite consensus did run through the anti-colonial movement, because British colonial rule was based on, for legitimacy, on principle of rule of law, while the anti-colonial movement was based on the principle of representation. So it did run in the anti-colonial period already, and therefore to say that it was just the elite consensus, how does one revisit? In this context, I would argue that he makes this distinction again in an argument between incumbent elite and emergent elite, and therefore he talks of the dichotomy between values and interests. But I would reframe it as if the conflict wouldn't it be more in terms of interest and legitimacy. It is the question of elites maintaining their legitimacy that they have to accommodate interests. Therefore, diversity and Francis Frankel's argument of politics of accommodation was necessary in process of maintaining their legitimacy. But a further question to you would be, in terms of your distinction between incumbent and emergent elite, is where do you place Dr. Ambedkar? Was it an incumbent elite or was it an emergent elite? I think a lot of questions that Ambedkar poses, I think, pose steep challenge to both the liberal notions of elite consensus, also to the post-colonial notions of foregrounding cultural arguments, because Ambedkar lays stress on modernity, modern state, so on and so forth. So I would be extremely interested. Of course, we can have a conversation later in terms of your understanding of the entire post-colonial approach, because it has occupied so much of space, especially in North America where you are working. I don't know how you have escaped the influence of post-colonial scholarship, and much of Indian political science research. Our young students, many of them are quite enamored and fascinated by post-colonial scholarship. That's a longer debate in terms of their argument of autonomous domains, subaltern politics, how you visualize all of that, because you don't seem to touch in most of your writings, at least the kind of readings I've done of your writings, you don't simply touch or respond to any of those. But that's another side point. My last point, I'm running out of time, I have some time. Okay, I'll conclude soon. My last point is in terms of explaining what I call the de-alignment thesis. I don't know if you have had Professor Varshney the opportunity to read Thomas Carather's recent piece in Journal of Democracy, where he published his article, July 2024, Misunderstanding Democratic Backsliding. Again, Professor Thomas Carather makes a very interesting, somewhat intriguing argument where he's saying that most of electoral autocratic regimes that have emerged, and he does again, the way you do, a global comparative case, includes India, where he says that this argument that democracy not doing well is the reason for the rise of autocracies or populist authoritarian regimes, he says, is a very thin argument. And in that, I think India is a very interesting case. That just when India and economic growth was looking up from 2004 to 14, that is when Hindu nationalists were voted to power. It was not when democracy was in crisis. It was not when economy was in crisis. It's a different matter. Hindu nationalists have pushed the economy into crisis. But 2004 to 14, Indian growth rate was anywhere between 8 to 9%. And they claim anywhere 271 million were pushed out of abject poverty. Those are contested data figures. But the broad argument that Professor Gudavarthy makes is that it has nothing to do with political voting behavior. That people do not elect autocrats. It is those who get elected on electoral agenda of development, which is partly true of Modi too. The 2014 election was not just the Hindutva agenda, was the development agenda. And it is once they are elected that they turn it into autocracies. And therefore his argument is that electoral behavior and people's choices have nothing to do with why autocrats emerge. And therefore he is turning, in a sense, your thesis on its head by arguing it is the elites, it is the political elite which gains consent in the name of development and then turn it into autocrat. It is not the people who support. If you have seen that Pew research survey which you have quoted, the survey also observed that many of the Indians in that survey also that they do not support authoritarians. And we can see that in the political behavior. The idea of Tanashahi, Indians are extremely sensitive to. The moment somebody becomes authoritarian, centralized, people seem to respond very quickly. So my last question to you would be, how do we explain this de-alignment thesis, both which is expressed top-down and bottom-up? The elites getting the name of development and then turning autocrats, why does that happen? Second, if it is not in terms of management of economic and socio-economic crisis. Second would be the de-alignment that is bottom-up. That people are increasingly angry with neoliberal reforms, both the Rust Belt crisis in North America and in India. But when they are angry with neoliberalism, they vote back more pro-corporate governance. This is a strange paradox that I have not yet made sense of, and I am hoping Professor Varshney will throw light on. I thank you again for this opportunity.